This event is an initiative of ELES fellow Or Yosefov, Or studied sociology, and is now working on his PhD at the Humboldt University in Berlin. His current research explores the engagement of civil society in war times. With that, it is now my pleasure to hand the moderation over to Or, who will guide us through the evening. Or, the mic is yours.
Oh, I think you're still on mute.
Can you unmute yourself, or yes, but you should be able now. Yes.
Hallelujah. Yeah, I can do it again. Cool.
It's
I'm able to talk.
7 years after COVID, and we all still make mistakes on Zoom. It's wonderful.
Unbelievable. Yeah, it just wasn't an option. Yeah, I think I didn't get the last few sentences of you, Michal. I think you were also muted for me for some reason. Or for
I
the
think we
other.
were centrally muted. So
Okay.
I just welcomed you guys and presented you or as a student, as a fellow who studied sociology, who is not working at his PhD, who is working on the engagement of civil society in war times, and who will take over the moderation from here on, and the mic is yours.
Sure. Thank you very much. And now everyone can also hear me. Thank you very much, Michal, for this lovely introduction. Maybe just as a quick note, our online participants, we wanted to urge you to ask and write down your questions in the chat here in any time, so that we will get to that after Amir's presentation. We can engage and have and raise our own questions to his book, but also on the aftermath of October 7. I'm very happy to welcome this evening Amir Tibon, our guest this evening. Amir works as a journalist for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, and is the author of the award-winning book presented here today, The Gates of Gaza, a story of betrayal, survival, and hope in Israel's borderlands. On October 7, Amir survived the Hamas attack on Kibbuz Nahal Oz, where he lives together with his wife and 2 daughters. The book recounts those moments of existential uncertainty from the perspective of his family barricaded in their safe room, ultimately rescued through an extraordinary courage of Amir's parents. At the same time, The Gates of Gaza offers a multi-layered portrait of the community of Kibbuz Nahal Oz near the Gaza border. I'm sure Amir will elaborate on that. And drawing on most Israeli and Palestinian sources, he examines the systematic failures that left civilians fully defenseless that horrific day. Amir's book presents a clear-eyed, yet at the end of the day, hopeful view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, its political implication, and the long-term societal consequences of October 7th. Earlier in his career, Amir also worked a couple of years for Haaretz, also as its correspondent in Washington, and co-authored a political biography of Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, the second president of the Palestinian National Authority, reflecting his long-standing engagement with both Palestinian and Israeli politics. Yeah, Amir, we are very happy to welcome you here, and thank you again for joining us. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Michal, thank you, Or, and thank you to everyone who chose to spend the coming hour with me, hear my story, and present questions. I highly appreciate it. My book, The Gates of Gaza, Die Tor von Gaza in the German edition, was born out of the catastrophe of October 7. On October 7, like you said, Or, I found myself with my wife and my 2 young daughters. At the time, they were 3.5 years old and 1.5 years old, so very young. We all found ourselves under attack. At first, there were mortars and rockets falling on our house, but this was not such an unusual thing, unfortunately, because our home is in Kibbuz Nahal Oz. It's a small Israeli community about a kilometer to the east of the border with Gaza, officially the closest Israeli community to the border with Gaza. And over the years, we experienced many situations where the community was under the rocket fire, mortar fire. Because of its unique proximity to Gaza, it is not defended by Iron Dome. And when there is a rocket or a mortar fired from Gaza toward Nahal Oz, you have 7 seconds to reach shelter. That's how long it takes from the moment that it is launched until it can land potentially on your house. That's reality for communities on the border with Gaza. And I'll talk a little bit more about those communities as we progress in our conversation this evening. But the situation of being under rocket fire and mortar fire, as we did on the morning of October 7, was not very unusual for our family. Around 7 a.m., however, the events of the day took a very sharp turn when we began to hear automatic gunfire. First a little distant and then coming closer and closer. And basically, by 7:15 a.m., our house was surrounded by a team of armed Hamas terrorists. We were locked in a small room, what we call the safe room. It's a room built of thick concrete, and it's supposed to protect you from rockets and mortars, but of course it is not very helpful when there is a ground invasion like we had on October 7. But we were barricading in that room with no electricity, no food, with our 2 young daughters, the 3.5 and the 1.5-year-old, while the Hamas team on our front porch was trying to break into the house, firing ammunition in the living room, through the windows, throwing grenades into the house. So very noisy situation and an unprecedented situation, because throughout all the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and of the different wars between Israel and Gaza, something like this has never happened on the Israeli border with Gaza. And in the book, I tell about the events of that day, how we eventually survived. Many of our neighbors were not as fortunate. We had friends who were murdered on that day, kidnapped into Gaza, friends who lost family members. Very, very terrible stories, all, in our small community and in the surrounding communities. And for me, the decision to write a book about all of this, it wasn't an easy one. Because after we survived October 7, we left the kibbutz around 10, maybe even 11 p.m. in the middle of the night, under fire. We were evacuated in a bus with many of our neighbors and friends, everybody shocked and traumatized. And then we were evacuated to another kibbutz, more kind of in north central Israel. I write about it in the book toward the end, Kibbutz Mishmar HaEmek, a beautiful place that agreed to host all of the families from our community. It's hundreds of people. And we came here, they had dorm rooms where they would send their teenagers, and all the teenagers went home. And each family from Nahal Oz, from our traumatized, distraught community, received a small room. It's a room, I can't even explain how small it is. But just imagine your average university dormitory, not the high-end ones, but the most simple ones. For our family, we had 4 mattresses on the floor, one for me, one for Miri, and one for each of the girls. And that's how we lived for several months, all of our community. We were trying to survive. We had friends kidnapped in Gaza. We had friends who we didn't know if they were dead or alive. We had to start over in a new place. We couldn't take anything with us because we were evacuated in the middle of the night, still under fire. So we were essentially refugees in a way. And, what do you do about, school for the kids, kindergarten, work? We were living in Nahal Oz. It's in the south of Israel. How do you find a job? Now you're more in the north. All of these things had to be taken care of. It was a very, very hectic time. But around, I would say, December 2023, 2 months after October 7, we had somewhat stabilized our life a little bit. There was a kindergarten that was opened here for the children of Nahal Oz, including my young daughters. And Miri, my wife, found a job. Miri is a social worker, and she works with the autistic children on the spectrum. She did this when we were living in the south of Israel, and she wanted to get back to work even under the circumstances I described before. So she pretty quickly found a job here in the area that we were evacuated to. And I went back to my work at Haaretz because the news did not stop. A lot of things were happening. It was a dramatic time. But after 2 months, I stopped for a second and I told myself, okay, we went through a historic event, October 7, and history continued every day with the war, with the fight for the hostages. And I realized I have to stop for a second and tell the story of what happened. I was also very disturbed by the fact that already from the beginning, there was a phenomenon of people denying, minimizing, and even justifying the atrocities of October 7 all over the world. And when we saw it starting from October 8, perhaps even from October 7 itself, I don't know. I was not following the news on October 7. I was trying to survive with my family. But I could see from October 8 this phenomenon of denial, minimization, and justification of the massacre and the kidnapping and the torture and all the terrible things that happened. And I took it upon myself to sit down and disengage from all the noise and first of all write the story as it happened to my family and to my community. Because a kibbutz is a small community at the end of the day. You can compare it to a village or a small town in Europe, but that doesn't really do it justice. In terms of size, yes, most of the kibbutzim are between 500 and 1,000 residents. But the community ties are uniquely strong. There is a shared sense of identity. And it's a place that even today, after going through many changes over the years, represents a certain kind of ideology. You can call it left-wing Zionism. I guess that's the most broad definition. And the kibbutzim were hurt very badly on October 7, including Nahal Oz, my small community. And so I wanted to tell the story, tell it through a family perspective and a community perspective. And I knew from the start that I wanted to write it in English, first of all, because these troubling things I was seeing all over the world, they were mostly happening abroad. Or the people, like I said, who were, denying and minimizing and justifying it. And I said, I have to tell the story to the world. And what I did, I just started writing. Like I said, we were going through a lot at the time, and the conditions were not ideal. But I would wake up every morning at 4, and I would leave our little room, leave Miri and the girls in our little room, and go and write in the library. And I would work until 6:30 in the morning. I would have 2.5 hours every morning just writing. By the way, that's also how I wrote my first book. But of course, back then it was a very different situation in my life. And during the day hours, that's when I conducted research. So I would do the writing 4 until 6:30 in the morning, then kind of organize the girls for the day, and during the day hours, I would try to do the research. Now, at first, my research focused mostly on the events of October 7 in Nahal Oz, what happened with the military, where was the military, the story, I write in the book, the story of the heroic security team of the kibbutz, including a neighbor of mine who died fighting the terrorists and others who survived but went through terrible trauma and pain. But very early on in the work process, I realized that if I will write only the story of October 7, I will be doing an injustice to the story of October 7, because October 7 is not a day that lives on an island, and it's not a bubble. October 7 is a very dramatic and impactful day in the history of 100-year-long conflict between two nations, two people. And you cannot understand October 7 if you don't understand very basic things about the conflict. Like, for example, why were kibbutzim founded along the Israeli border with Gaza? There are 20 different kibbutzim along that border. Why? What caused Israel to build these small communities on the border? Who would go and live there? Why would people, including me and my family, by the way, because I was not born or raised in Nahal Oz. I actually grew up in a totally different part of Israel. Why would someone choose to go and live there? And something that often surprised people when they would hear it, and I would get questions about it after October 7, why were these communities so, let's call it peace-seeking in their outlook and so supportive of peace with the Palestinians and of the two-state solution? And you had this story, including, by the way, in my own kibbutz, of people who volunteered in humanitarian organizations that helped Palestinians from Gaza. How can you have that kind of view of the world when you live in a community that is bombarded by Palestinian terrorists from Gaza on a regular basis? And then how did October 7 change people's point of view and the politics? And then there is a whole big story about Netanyahu and Hamas that I also felt had to be told, because Hamas, when Benjamin Netanyahu became the prime minister of Israel in the year 2009, Hamas did not have the capabilities to conquer entire Israeli communities and slaughter and kidnap their residents. Simply, they couldn't do it. They didn't have the ability to do it in many different factors. What happened between 2009 and 2023 that suddenly we woke up one day to Hamas conquering an entire region of Israel, slaughtering the civilians, kidnapping people, overcoming military bases? What happened during those 14 years? How did this become possible? And there's a huge story behind it, of course, of Netanyahu purposefully, as a policy decision, strengthening Hamas, coddling Hamas, preferring Hamas. And this is a huge part of the story as well. So all of this had to be told, and this is already a lot for one, I would say, humble book, because this is not a 700-pager. Okay, this is, I don't know how many pages it is in German. In English, it's about 300, kind of like your average
I think
size.
also in German it is around 300, 350.
Yeah. What I decided to do is to write it basically in a back and forth kind of structure, where I begin the book on October 7 at 6:29 a.m. when the first mortar falls near our house and we wake up from the explosion. And that's chapter 1. But then chapter 2 is a history chapter that goes back to the 1950s, to the foundation of Nahal Oz, and actually it even goes a little further back to the 1940s, to Israel's War of Independence, the Palestinian Nakba, the creation of the Gaza Strip, right? Because if you look at the maps before 1948, there is no such thing as the Gaza Strip. There is the city of Gaza. Yes, it's along the coast. You have Tel Aviv and Jaffa and Ashdod and Majdal, which we call Ashkelon, and then you have Gaza City, but there's no Gaza Strip. So you even have to explain how the Gaza Strip was created, which is a fascinating story of a historical accident. So, chapter 2 is a history chapter, and then chapter 3, I go back to October 7. Chapter 4 is again a history chapter about the Six-Day War, Israel conquering Gaza, the relationships. And basically, that's how the book goes back and forth between the events of October 7 in our house, in my kibbutz, and the story of my parents, the rescue story, you can call it, and their journey from Tel Aviv to come to the kibbutz under fire and save us and save many other people. So it goes back and forth between October 7, the different kind of scenes that are included, and the history. And I felt it was very important to do it this way because otherwise people won't understand. Why did we go and live there? What is this place? Why would anyone live there? Why is there an enmity between the people in Gaza and the Israelis on the other side of the border? How did Hamas become so powerful? How could they do this? How could Israel not pick up all the intelligence signs? What was going on in Israel and in Gaza before this happened? All of those are critical questions. I can tell you so I had already kind of like a structure and a chapter and a half, and I went with this to find a publisher. And the book was purchased by Little Brown and Company, which is a pretty big publisher in the United States. And I was assigned a wonderful editor, Alex Littlefield. And Alex told me right away that he likes the idea of the back and forth between October 7 and the history, but he said under one condition. And then he came along with such a beautiful American sentence. He said, the historical chapters should not feel like you have to eat your vegetables. Which to an Israeli is a bit strange because in Israel, we don't force kids to eat vegetables. Like my girls like to eat vegetables because when you put good olive oil and salt on any vegetable, it becomes delicious. But I understand that in the American culture, it's like, you have to eat your vegetables. And Alex said the historical chapters shouldn't be. You have to eat your vegetables. They have to be interesting just as much as the October 7 chapters. Otherwise, people will just skip them. They will get into the drama of October 7 and they will skip all the history. And that was a very important tip that he gave me. And it caused me to change the way I wrote the history chapters. Instead of just telling the history as a stream of facts, I told it through the personal narratives and personal stories of people from my kibbutz. So, for example, in the chapter, I think it is number 7, about the failed peace process of the 1990s and the early 2000s, I don't just write, and then Yitzhak Rabin was murdered. I hope I'm not giving a spoiler to anyone. But I don't just write, oh, and then Rabin was murdered. I actually tell the story of a man from the kibbutz who was at the peace rally in Tel Aviv where Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated and saw it with his own eyes and drove back from Tel Aviv to the Gaza border with tears flowing because he understood the severity of what had just happened and the consequences it could have. So all of the historical chapters are told through the personal stories of neighbors of mine from Kibbuz Nahal Oz, and I return to those neighbors in the October 7 chapters to see what happened to them. And that was a very good tip. I wrote the book. It took me 7 months to write it. I had to do it very fast because the American publisher wanted it out for the 1-year mark of October 7. Again, they had a smart analysis. They said, people will want to read about this in late September, early October 2024. In November 2024, you guys remember there was an election in the United States. And basically they said after November, there's a good chance nobody will want to read about other people's troubles anymore because we'll have enough drama over here in America. Which I think was partially right. But so I had to finish it in 7 months. It came out in the US on time. It's been quite successful. I can say it sold more than 20,000 copies so far. And it's attracting a diverse readership. Of course, a lot of interest in the American Jewish community, but I also get a lot of reactions from people, American Muslims, American Arabs who read the book and had very different thoughts about it and responses. And I always am encouraged by thoughtful responses to the book, even if there is criticism and you could have done this better, you could have done that better. And I get it from both sides, by the way, from the right and the left and everything in between. After writing it in English, I translated it myself into Hebrew. and it came out in Israel. And I'm also very proud that Suhrkamp Verlag chose to publish it in German. I'm proud because, first of all, I think Germany is a very, very important country in the world today. And in a way, you can argue taking on the mantle of leadership of the liberal world because somebody else who used to do it is, let's say, on vacation in a sense. And specifically, I want to say something about Suhrkamp. My great-grandfather, Werner Kraft, was a German, well, first of all, citizen and a veteran of World War I, but also a German writer and a poet and literary critic who wrote his PhD and worked in the library of, well, first, it's a long story, but eventually found himself in Hanover. After the Nazis rose to power, he had to leave Germany because he was a Jew, a communist, and an intellectual, which is like in Vegas when you get the 3 cherries on the slot machine. So back then, if you were a Jew, a communist, and an intellectual, it was not so good, and he had to flee Germany. But later in his life, after the war, the Holocaust, when he was already situated in Jerusalem, he returned to write in German, and he wrote for German magazines and newspapers, and he published more than 30 books in Germany. And some of them were published by Suhrkamp Verlag. And when I came last year to visit the publisher, and I had an event in Berlin to promote the book, I received a wonderful gift from Suhrkamp, which were basically 2 books side by side, Dito from Gaza, my book, and a book in German by my great-grandfather Werner Kraft, which unfortunately I cannot read because I don't read German, but it gave me motivation to perhaps learn. The book has also been published in French, Italian, Romanian, Hungarian. My project for 2026 is to get the book published in Arabic and to offer it somehow for free in Arabic to download from the internet, because I don't think, sadly, I don't think I will find a publisher who would actually print it and sell it in the Arab world. I just don't think, unfortunately, that it's possible, which is a sad testament to the reality we live in. But I do believe that it can be translated and it can be offered online. And it's very important for me that the book will also be available in Arabic, and that anybody speaking and reading that beautiful language, which I speak and read and understand to some degree, anyone who is interested will be able to read it and get an Israeli perspective on the events of October 7 and on the history that led there. The book doesn't cover a lot of the war itself. It kind of fades out. I write about the issue of the hostages. I write about the destruction of Gaza and how it looked like from the Israeli side of the border. I write toward the end of the book that I want the war to end, and I lost faith in the goals of the war at a certain point, like many people in Israel. But I don't go in great detail into the events of the war. But still, I think it's a book that can perhaps foster dialogue and be a basis for a conversation. And that's really what I want to achieve. So I will stop here because I've already spoken quite a lot, and I hope people have questions. And I'll take another sip of tea. And then, or maybe you want to present some questions, maybe people from the audience want to send, but I'm here to answer. So go ahead, please.
Sure. Thank you very much, Amir. We are also hoping that you will find maybe a publisher or a place that would eventually translate it to Arabic, following a bigger readership in some way. And thank you also very much for explaining also this in some way unusual table of contents of like jumping back and forth from the present to the past, to the present to the past, and how you narrate it through personal perspective and experiences of members of the community of Kibbuz Nahal Oz. Maybe before we move to questions from the audience, which you could, as I said in the beginning, you can always write them down in the chat, and we can ask then Amir and raise them. I wanted to ask you, you recall that in the war of 2014, I think it's in the first chapter of your book, you were still in sort of outside observer because you were living in Tel Aviv. You were not a member of the Kibbuz Nahal Oz. But after moving to Nahal Oz, you become both a resident and a reporter in war zone, ultimately experiencing war, as you mentioned, also literally inside your own living room. I was wondering, how has this shift from sort of a distant observer Israeli that kind of like don't really know the day-to-day life or the everyday life of the borderlands of Israel, how this shift from a distant observer to a direct affected person change your journalistic work, if it has, or writing as both a survivor, but also as a journalist that has certain objective in front of you?
It's a good question, and I would obviously draw a big dividing line of before and after October 7. Before October 7, my decision to move from Tel Aviv to Nahal Oz and continue to work as a journalist, and at some point I, become a diplomatic correspondent for Haaretz. I felt like actually it was a bit of a secret advantage, because I could see with my own eyes some of the things that I was reporting about, specifically when it came to Israel and Gaza, which was for many years a military issue, but also a diplomatic issue, right? You had all this cooperation with Qatar and agreements and the trucks that would come in with the cement and the dollars that were brought to the border crossing from Qatar, and all of those things you could really see with your own eyes. And you could sense when things were getting more tense, when things were actually going to some de-escalation. I felt it was actually quite helpful. Of course, it also came with challenges because most of the media ecosystem is in Tel Aviv, a little bit is in Jerusalem, where the parliament and the government are located. And when you go to live outside of those places, in a more peripheral part of the country, and just to get it straight, I mean, Israel is such a tiny country. From Nahal Oz to Tel Aviv, if you can take the train, there's a train station in the Sderot, which is the largest city in the border area. It's 1 hour on the train. Okay, Israel is very small.
If the train is running from Sderot.
Exactly. There can be problems
Yeah.
with the train, but let's assume it's working. And if you don't have to drive through traffic, if you can leave home a little earlier or a little later and avoid the traffic, an hour and 20 minutes. I mean, it's all very close. But you still pay a certain price because at the end of the day, especially in the evening when there is kind of like work affiliated socializing, people go out to drink and exchange gossip and tips and ideas. You're not there. You're back in your house in the kibbutz on the border. But for me, I knew that this was part of the decision. I was very proud and very kind of, feeling in my heart that it was the right thing. And I loved the life on the kibbutz. And I also felt that it brought certain advantages also for my work. Of course, after October 7, it's a different situation. And I think, it was very hard for me, for example, to write about the issue of the hostages when I'm basically writing about friends of mine, people I know personally, family, close relatives, like a son or a brother of other friends of mine. It just was so personal. And I was writing about this, as a diplomatic correspondent and then as a senior analyst for the newspaper. It was very hard to, and you know what? I don't think I succeeded actually, to create some kind of an imaginary wall between my connection to this issue from a personal, emotional place and my writing about it. I think it's beyond what is humanly possible to create that kind of, complete distance. And again, maybe you can say that it brought some advantages to my work, especially when I was writing more as an analyst. I felt like I brought a certain passion to writing about this issue, and maybe that hopefully had somewhat of an impact on some of the readers, especially with an eye to Washington, people who read my articles in the English edition of Haaretz. I don't know. We'll find out one day.
Cool. Yeah, thank you very much for your answer. Maybe another question I had before we move to the question from the audience. You mentioned it also briefly. So in Kibbuz Nahal Oz, 15 people were murdered on the 7th of October, eight were kidnapped. One of
Yes.
them was your dear friend Omri Miran, who also came back after he was held hostage for
Yes.
738 days. He was eventually released through a hostage deal after significant pressure on the US Trump administration, who put even more significant pressure on the Netanyahu government. I wanted to ask, how has Omri's return to his wife and daughters affected the community of Nahal Oz? How does the community begin to support a sort of reintegration or health process after such a prolonged captivity, while at the same time also living its own trauma? I think you mentioned you were dislocated, evacuated to another place, living in Mishmar HaEmek. How does this whole...
Yeah. Okay. First of all, October 13, that's the day Omri was returned
October 13.
with 19 other living hostages. And it was a day of joy and just pure happiness. A few weeks afterwards, I had an event in Paris for the French edition of the book. It won a prize in France. And Miri and I flew there. And we were like walking the streets, and we suddenly said, we can actually be happy. Because I can tell you, until Omri returned, nothing in life was really happy. Nothing. I mean, even the best moments. And during those 2 years, sometimes we had good moments. You have a birthday for your child, you have a good day at work, you have some professional success, you do something fun as a family. These things still happened. We lived our life.
Yeah.
But there was never a sense of real happiness, because all this time, people are dying. There's a war going on, and you have a friend who's there caught in the middle of it. You don't know if he can survive, if he's alive. And suddenly, in November, it was about maybe 3.5, 4 weeks after he returned, we were like, it's just this feeling of relief.
Yeah.
At the same time, we remember also the fact that more than 40 hostages were kidnapped alive on October 7, but did not return alive. They returned dead, including Tzachi Idan, my friend and neighbor from Kibbuz Nahal Oz, who we could have brought him back alive to his family.
He was also a journalist, right?
No. Okay. You are confusing with Ro'i Idan, who was a journalist, photojournalist from Kibbutz Kfar Aza.
Yeah.
Who was murdered on October 7 with his wife, but his 3-year-old daughter was kidnapped and saved by an incredible family from their kibbutz. Somebody should write a book about that story as well. But remember Tzachi, and remember more than 40 other hostages who, like I said, we could have saved them if we made a deal earlier, if we made it the top priority to save their lives. So it's always, mixed feeling around this issue. But today, obviously, the situation is better in a sense, but I can tell you the war is not completely over yet. And, if you come and spend a weekend in Nahal Oz, you will hear all night the bombardments and the explosions. And this is not a real ceasefire in that regard. It's better than the situation before, when you had huge numbers of people dying and you had hostages, and from the Israeli side, soldiers getting killed and injured every day. But the situation is not really stable. And from my experience, in our part of the world, there is no status quo. Things either get better or they get worse. And with the current situation in Gaza, it's not going to hold this way. That Hamas controls half the territory, Israel controls half the territory. There is still daily exchanges of fire, just with less casualties. It's not going to stay this way. It either gets better, which means you move into phase 2 of President Trump's plan. You begin to actually implement the reconstruction, or it will get worse and it will be another war. My preference is obviously for the other option, but we have to acknowledge this situation.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much for this insights. Maybe moving on to questions from the audience. Michal, do you want to read one of them?
Yes, we have already some questions from the audience. Very specific ones, for example, what is the situation in Nahal Oz today? Are you already back home? And how was your work, your book received in Israel, in the community in Nahal Oz, and also specifically in the political Israel?
Okay. Nahal Oz today, about 50, maybe already 55% of the population has returned. A lot of people have returned recently since the ceasefire was announced and the return of the hostages. Our family is not returned yet. We are still in Mishmar HaEmek. We are waiting for the school year to finish, and then we can move back with the girls. We had a deliberation around this. Should we move them in the middle of the school year or wait until June? And we decided to wait. We go back quite a lot to visit. We renovated our house. So today, all the damages of October 7 in our house are no longer visible. All the bullet marks, bullet holes, grenades, everything. I mean, the house was in need of some serious work, but we did it. And we love going to the house, especially on the weekend. We take the girls, we sleep there. They meet some of their friends who their families have already returned. And last time we were there, it was a very noisy weekend. I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. So it was a bit difficult to sleep during the night because of all the explosions. But I hope next time we go there, which is pretty soon, it will be a more quiet weekend. And Nahal Oz is a beautiful kibbutz, beautiful community. I believe by the end of this school year, we will have more than 70% of the residents back home. I also know that some of the people will not return at all. And I don't think anybody can be judged on this decision. And I hope and believe other people will join and want to take part in rebuilding this community for the future. Regarding the question about the book, the book sold a very nice amount of copies in Israel. I don't have exact numbers, but I suspect it's between 15 and 20,000 copies. It won an award here in Israel, the Bernstein Prize, which is one of the top literary prizes in Israel. So it won the prize for 2025. It received good reviews in the media, and it continues to sell and create interest. Of course, not everybody liked it. The book is very critical of the Netanyahu government for the failures of this government that led us to October 7. It's very harsh on the prime minister. And some of his supporters don't want to read this reality. They prefer a different version of reality. Basically, we are facing two efforts today to deny and minimize October 7. One effort is coming from outside of Israel. It's by the BDS Intifada crowd, people who hate Israel, and they are trying to minimize, deny, or justify October 7 for that reason. The second effort, unfortunately, is coming from inside Israel, and it is being led by the prime minister and his supporters. They are trying to minimize the uniqueness of October 7, to wash it away, make the Israelis forget about it. They want the conversation to focus on all the great achievements that came afterwards in Iran and Lebanon. I don't know how great the achievements actually were. We'll find out in time. But that's what they want people to talk about. They don't want people to talk about October 7. Or they want people to think that October 7 was something that could not be avoided. There was no way to foresee it. It's all the fault of the army or the intelligence or the legal advisor or my grandmother or my dead great-great-grandmother. It doesn't really matter. Anybody but the man who was prime minister since 2009. So obviously that has created some criticism. I don't care. I mean, it's fine. People can say what they want, but the book is selling well. People are reading it, and it's creating very interesting conversations.
Cool. Thank you very much for your answer. Uriel is asking, thank you very much for your presentation and work. I wanted to ask you, after all your research, writing, and experiences, what do you think are the possibilities for peace and for a better democracy in Israel? How do you experience the growing polarization inside of Israel?
I think Israel is going through a crisis that many democracies are going through these days. Extremism, polarization, and virtual realities, if you will. People who just like live in a different reality. It's not an argument over how the facts should be understood. It's an argument over the facts themselves that is tearing apart our society. It's a very difficult phenomenon, it can be very dangerous. But I try to remain an optimist and to believe that in 2026 there will be an election in this country and we will see political change. Regarding peace with the Palestinians, on this I am less of an optimist. Oh, let's just put it, I take a longer view. In the short term, there is very little reason for optimism. The situation today between Israelis and Palestinians is it's dire. I mean, the level of hatred, suspicion, and fear, just gripping fear between the two people, I think it's the highest it has been in my lifetime. And it shouldn't come as a surprise because look what happened over the last 2 years. Look what happened on October 7. Look what happened to the hostages. Look what happened in Gaza. Look what is happening now in the West Bank. I mean, terrible things are happening. And this is creating hatred and suspicion and mostly fear. I think Israelis fear the Palestinians. Palestinians fear the Israelis. And this is driving us to a very bad place. I do want to note that if you take a longer view of history, look at Germany and France, for example. Two countries that for many, many years, you can say centuries, but you can even look at kind of a more condensed period of decades, killed millions of each other's people. And today, when you cross from France to Germany, or the other way around, you don't even pass through a border checkpoint. You don't even have to show your passport. So maybe we can reach that place one day. Maybe. I want to be hopeful, but I think it will take a long time, and there will have to be a serious process of just de-escalation, because the level today of fear in our societies is the highest it has ever been, or at least in my lifetime.
Yeah, but building also on this last question, but do you see also the demilitarization projects or prospects of the Gaza Strip as probable? You mentioned the second part of the Trump peace plan.
Yeah.
There's the stabilization force that should come apparently from Turkey, Azerbaijan, whatever neighboring countries that willingly will send us
I think there is an inherent contradiction between the idea of the international force entering Gaza and the international force taking away the guns of Hamas. There will be an international force only if they know that they don't need to take away the guns. I don't see any country actually doing that. That's just the cold, bitter truth. I do think you can get Hamas to give up their rocket launchers, their mortars. I don't know how much of it they have left anyway. I think the biggest question and the one thing Israel should insist on is actually drones. Not AK-47s and M16s. We are never going to collect the last one of those, and Hamas will not give it away. I think Hamas will be able, under the right kind of pressure, to give up their rocket and mortar capabilities. But the biggest question mark and the biggest problem is the drones. We saw in Ukraine, in the war between Israel and Hezbollah also, by the way, the threat of the small drone industry and what it can do and how it can terrorize communities. And this is the one thing we should insist on as a red line, that Hamas will not have its own industry of small drones being created in Gaza. But the idea that the Turkish or Pakistani soldiers will go door to door in Gaza City and collect the guns, that's just idiotic. It's not going to happen.
It's interesting you mentioned drones, because we see like an increasing problem also on the Israel-Egyptian border concerning drones, concerning bringing weaponry to, I don't know, criminals, smuggling weapons inside Israel.
We see it in Europe. A few months ago, a theater in Salzburg, the city theater of Salzburg in Austria, put up a play based on my book. It was done by Nuran David Kales, who's a wonderful theater director, and he wrote a wonderful play based on the gates of Gaza. And it went up in the historical theater of Salzburg, and we were invited to see the play. And we flew there. It was right around the time of the ceasefire. And, the day after the show, Miri and I are walking the quiet streets of Salzburg, beautiful, serene little town, and suddenly we hear sirens, alarms, and we get a message to our phone. Now, I don't really read German, but there were, just a few words there that I understood, and I told her it's a drill. They are doing a citywide drill for the sirens, and I guess it was, later we understood it was because of what was happening in Munich at the time, with those unidentified drones that caused a panic in the airport.
Yeah.
This is a real problem, and it's a global problem, and we have to insist that Hamas does not develop that kind of capability.
Sure. Masha asks, what gives you hope to keep going with your work nowadays?
My daughters.
Your daughters.
My daughters. That's what I do. Everything I do is for them. That's the only thing. That they will be able to live peacefully and grow up happily in Israel, in Kibbuz Nahal Oz, and have a good country and a good life and good relationship with the neighbors on the other side who also deserve a good life. Yes.
Definitely. Irina was asking also about the reaction about your book on the political side. I think you mentioned it, but maybe it was referred to politicians, but I don't know if
Listen, I know it was read by many, many people in politics, in Israel and also in other countries, by the way. But I care more about the reactions of high school students, soldiers here in Israel. I had people send it to me from inside Gaza, during their reserve duty. I had friends of mine who are originally from Gaza, Palestinians, but had left Gaza and are living abroad now, that, they read the books. Reactions from ordinary people are more important for me than what some member of Knesset said about the book.
Freddie asks, what's your take on the future of Gaza over the next 5 years? I think you kind of touched it in some ways.
I hope that the Trump plan can work. I think we have to be humble about what it can achieve and what it cannot achieve. And I think if there is a different Palestinian government that is not Hamas, but it's a government of more moderate elements in the Palestinian society, supported by countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan, and of course the Palestinian Authority. There is a chance for reconstruction and a better future for Gaza. If Hamas clings on to power, nothing good will come out of it, because countries will not put money on rebuilding Gaza if they think that 3 or 4 years from today, there can be another war between Israel and Hamas. I mean, why burn your own money? Why put your own money on fire? If you're investing the billions upon billions that it will take to rebuild Gaza, you want to see that there is a different government there. It's not Hamas, so there wouldn't be a war 3 or 4 years down the line, and all your investment will become rubble again. This is an important part of the equation. I think we can do maybe 2 or 3 more questions before I my voice runs out.
Sure. Michal, do you want to pick one of the questions?
Well, maybe as a follow-up to what you just told, Amir, there's a question asking what changes do you see in the Arab world for a peace process?
I think before October 7, there was an important movement toward expanding the Abraham Accords and signing more agreements directly between Israel and Arab countries, bypassing the Palestinians. I think October 7 and the war made that more difficult and reinstated the Palestinians at the heart of the Middle East peace process. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, anyone will have their own opinion, but I think that's the reality today. And I think there is still a great deal of interest in the Arab world for getting closer to Israel, for fostering good ties with Israel, enjoying the benefits of economic and intelligence relationships with Israel. But in order to turn all of that positive energy into diplomatic, formal relations, there has to be also something on the Palestinian issue. And the current Israeli government is not ready for that, which means this will remain probably for the next Israeli government that will show perhaps a more flexible diplomatic approach in order to seal these dramatic deals with the Arab world.
And maybe also following that, Felix was asking, given the most promising candidate to defeat Netanyahu seems to be at the moment Naftali Bennett, and given the general drift to the right in the Israeli political scene, how exactly would you imagine this change to look like?
It's important to understand that today the main dividing issue in Israeli politics is not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is the question of what kind of country does Israel want to be? A functioning liberal democracy or a corrupt Middle Eastern monarchy? This is the choice today. And the question of the occupation, settlements, the Palestinians, it's still an important issue in our politics, but it's no longer number 1. It's not even number 2. It is an important issue, but we first of all have to define who we are before we can discuss what exactly are we going to do with our neighbors. And this is the battle right now in Israel. It's between parties from both the left and the right. It's a broad spectrum. But parties that insist on the basic structure of a functioning liberal democracy versus parties who want to turn Israel into some version of Iran, theocratic, ultra-religious dictatorship with the one person on top making all the decisions. This is what is at stake in Israel today.
So it boils down to the question of the character of the state.
Yeah,
Is it
exactly.
going to be still a Jewish
And this was true
Israeli
before. This was
democracy?
true before October 7, when we had the big protests all over the country, and it is still true today, and it will be the defining issue of the next Israeli election.
To pick up a last question?
Yeah, let's take one last question.
Cool. Noga asked, your political opinion changed or intensified before and after the 7th of October?
I don't think my political opinion changed in terms of politics.
Yeah.
I was against this government. I thought that they were a dangerous, failed government. And October 7 didn't exactly convince me otherwise. I think my belief in the possibility of peace and cooperation with the Palestinians, of course, became weaker as a result of not just October 7, but everything that happened over the past 2 years. And I think this is something that happened to a lot of people in Israel and also many Palestinians, by the way. And it's part of the lingering long-term effects that these events will have. Like I said, that the level of suspicion is high, but I don't think it means the door is completely shut. It never is completely shut. And things can change, dynamics can change. The most important thing, I think, in that regard is to actually see the Trump plan for Gaza move into the second phase and some kind of positive momentum. Sometimes that by itself can be enough to drive a different dynamic.
Yeah, well, thank you very much on that note.
Thank you.
Thank you
And
very
of
much
course,
for joining us.
if you haven't read Die Tor von Gaza, you can find it in
Awesome.
bookstores and on the website of Suhrkamp Verlag. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Amir. And thank you, Michal, and for everyone also participating and writing your question down.
Well, I
Thanks
really
from my
appreciate
side
it.
too.